Hi everyone, welcome to ECON2111. So today is the unit on the economic history for of Canada to 1913, and today we're dealing with the topic of mercantilism. And again, I want you to bear in mind what we're trying to do here. We're trying to explain the big questions that relate to the Great Divergence, but from Canada's vantage point. So we know Canada's a rich country. We know it's relatively rich relative to other places in in the world, but not as rich relative to the United States. And within Canada, there are important differences. Today, what we're going to be trying to do is at least explain the differences between Canada and the rest of North America. And we won't be saying what works. We'll be pointing out one explanation that just doesn't do it. It's an explanation that isn't enough to explain why Canada is poor, and that explanation that doesn't really matter. Well, it's not that it doesn't matter, it's that it's not strong enough to be of great relevance. It's mercantilism. So we're gonna view what is mercantilism, what form it took, and we're gonna see some of the economics of mercantilism and does it lead to richer societies, and then we're gonna deal with the issue of empirical magnitude of the problem it posed. But then at the end, we're going to do a quick tour on why would countries adopt mercantilistic policies. Okay, so what is mercantilism? So mercantilism is not really an ideology. A lot of people have called it that, but it's not. It's not a very well defined system of ideas, but it has a common thread. And that common thread is that governments are supportive of business, but in a way that is meant to restrict imports and encourage exports. And the idea is that you want to basically use business, mercantile interest. By the way, this is the origin of the world. Mercantilism, mercantile, and mercantile being like a word for, well, business, but mercantile interest, mercantilism. But to use mercantile interest, that's the goal of mercantilism. Use mercantile interest to favor uh, a particular position of a ruler or king, and the idea for the reason why a king or ruler would be advantaged by promoting mercantile interest. The story was that if you exported more than you imported, you were going to get an inflow of gold and silver into your country, and not have an outflow of these. So, and if you had more gold and more silver, you also had more power. And that was essentially the theory of, I mean, that's the common thread for mercantilism. And in mercantilism, then the goal is to create import duties, to give special treatments to businesses, so import duties, so to prevent foreign competitors from entering a market, uh, and to give special treatment to businesses, give them I don't know, tax discounts, to give them legal advantages, legal monopoly rights, for example, on certain activities. I can take a great multiple forms. And we're going to see like a few example in a minute or so, like the shape that it took. But for us, mercantilism, there is an extra element that needs to be added. It's colonies. So, what role did colonies played inside our mercantilist system? And the reason why we care about colonies is, well, Canada is a colony. Like at that point in time, so we're talking 17th, 18th century. Canada is, well, still a colony until the 19th century, but that colony status, how does it fit into a mercantile set of ideas? Well, the idea is that under mercantilism, a colony is only there to provide the raw materials that the metropolis, the home country, the mother country, the father country, whatever you want to call it, requires to produce manufactured goods for exports. So it basically kind of relinquishes the role of colonies as pretty much suppliers of raw resources and not much else. they're subservient to uh, to the mother country. So there's kind of a hierarchical status between them. Okay, so what form does mercantilism take for policies? Well, I think the best example of a mercantilist policy that lasted for more than 2 centuries in this case is that of the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts. So there's a series of acts, but then some of them are adopted at different dates. But the Navigation Act of 1651 is the one that really starts to get the ball rolling, and it prohibited for Britain any ship to bring to carry goods between British ports. So imagine that you get the island of Britain, and there's the port of Liverpool, and there's the port of London. Only ships owned by British merchants could travel between the two cities. Okay, and we still have laws like these, by the way, today. In Canada, for example, it's illegal for Air France to provide services between Toronto and Montreal, or between Vancouver and Montreal. They are allowed to provide services from Vancouver to Paris, or from Montreal to Paris, but they can't provide service within the Canadian market. So the Navigation Act of 1651, does something like that. It limits the ability of foreigners to provide trade within the area of Britain. So they're allowed to come, but only from foreign ports to some degree. Now, the other part is that all goods that were that came into England had to be carried, so from abroad, had to be carried on a British vessel, or a vessel that was registered in the country of origins of the good. So you couldn't have a Dutch ship that starts in Amsterdam. Well, I think Rotterdam would be better in this case as an example, I think. From Rotterdam to, I don't know, Kiel in Germany, and then stops in Oslo and then goes to London. That cannot be done. It can only do Rotterdam to London, and that was it. So that system creates a really an issue whereby you would have higher costs for transport, because you would have a lesser supply of, you'd have less a supply schedule that is lower, because of the marginal costs are higher to provide any unit of services because of those restrictions. And there is so you'd have less shipping, and that less shipping would happen at a higher price. The other part that is important, especially for us, is that the Navigation Act prevented trade by foreign ships between the mother country and its colonies. So that meant that, for example, in our case, French ships could not provide services, say, between London and Boston in the United States. So that's the Navigation Act. And you have laws like the Navigation Act that exist for a multiplicity of countries. They're not always in the same shape, they're not always identical, but there's always types of laws like this. And eventually, for example, the Navigation Act, so there's a French version of the Navigation Act that's a bit different, and I don't want to get into the details, but there's something along those lines. But once, for example, the big part of Canada that is Quebec gets conquered by the British, the Navigation Act are extended to include this new colony. And these types of restrictions are really problematic. As I said, they increase the cost of supplying any given unit of cargo that you ship around. But this is not the only shape. So, like, another one that was very well known is that, for example, in New France, so the colony of Quebec in Canada, you had something like the Navigation Act that existed, but you also had something like the governors who are named by the King of France that are prohibited from sorry, no, they're not prohibited. They the governors prohibit the construction of certain manufacturing activities. So, for example, Quebec, the French part of Canada, was uh, exporting furs, so like beaver pelts, moose skins, and these would be used in Europe to make hats. And by edict of the colonial governor, it was illegal for Canadians, so people who lived in Quebec, to because that was their name back then, the Canadiens. Uh, it was illegal for them to uh, take beaver pelts and moose skins and convert them themselves into hats or pieces of clothing. They could only export the pelts of the animals themselves to foreign markets. They could not transfer them before export. Uh, and so this was the kind of regulation. You can see how this would fit into the mercantilistic logic, because if the goal of the metropolitan government, the home country, is to export as much manufactured good as possible to the rest of the world, then having the colony export itself some of its uh, manufactured goods, then you would actually be removing some potential exports for the home country. So, in the mercantilistic logic, the colony really needs to be entirely subservient to the mother country, and it can never be like a value added sector. It can only like the only it can be like a final goods sector, I should say. And that's a really important status of subserviency. And uh, the the reason why it's we'll see why it was often presented as a way it made the colonies poorer, but this kind of ideology, you can see, is probably detrimental to economic growth already in some ways, because there's the fact that restricting the supply of shipping services means that the cost of any given unit of service, the price, sorry, for consumers is going to be higher. By restricting the supply, you also prohibit certain activities from developing in the colony. So that means that there's fewer industrial activity, less diversification. All of these would be ways in which you can see that there is uh, a way for the colony to be made poorer from mercantilism. And not only that, but to those two things I've mentioned, you're also restricting your foreign demand. If you can only export to France, well, you're only exporting to a market at that time that had 30 million people, whereas Britain was like 6 or 7 million, the Netherlands, I think 1 or 2, Spain, Italy, the United States. Like, add more and more country, foreign demand grows if you have access to a larger and larger market. So that removing mercantilistic interest would have probably, you can see how it would have made the place richer. They would have had access to larger markets, they would have had access to cheaper shipping services, and they would have had the right to develop certain industries that they could not legally under mercantilism. But how can we make sense of whether a set of mercantilist policy makes a country richer? Like I've the way I've explained it, it's kind of obvious if I say it like that. But we want to formalize the reason why mercantilism doesn't make a society richer. We want to formalize this just a bit more. And I think the best way to do it is to go with that thing you saw in introductory macro. And in introductory macro, you saw this accounting identity. And it's an accounting identity. It's not an economic model, by the way. It's just an accounting identity. And it says GDP is equal to the sum of all consumptions. All right. So C is consumption of final goods by consumers. I is the formation of capital goods. G is government spending on final goods, and XN is net exports. And so basically, what we are, what foreigners are consuming from us. Now, In this case, under mercantilism, the term you're interested about is XN. So XN, as I said, is net export. It's you want this to be as big as positive. Net export, by the way, is exports minus imports. You want this number to be as big as possible. And under mercantilistic logic, if this is as big as possible, you're not only richer, but you get more gold coming into your country from foreigners, and you can, well, essentially in a case like this, uh, be in a better position to wage war against them. That's the perspective of the king when he applies a set of mercantilist policies. But it is a fallacy to say that the idea of making xn x subscript n. Sorry, I should be more precise because it's not x at the power of n or x times n. It's n subscript x. Sorry, x subscript n. To say that making this term bigger is what causes economic growth or richer societies is a bit rubbish because of this guy here, right? So remember I said that this is an accounting identity, not an economic model. If you're in an open economy, has a cousin, and that cousin is the net capital outflow. So a net capital outflow is your residence purchase of foreign assets. So how much of claims or shares or securities in foreign businesses I buy as a Canadian, minus what foreigners buy of securities and shares and stocks in Canadian businesses. That's the net capital outflow. So just to give you an idea, when a Canadian buys stocks in Telmex, so that's the Mexican phone company, the purchase raises the net capital outflow for Canada, because here you have a Canadian that purchases a foreign asset. So there's a greater net outflow. But when a Japanese resident, for example, buys a bond issued by a Canadian firm, so you could be like Bell Canada or Air Canada, well, that purchase reduces the net capital outflow. So how does a net capital outflow relate to I and X subscript N? Well, the reason why is that for pure accounting reasons, net capital outflow, NCO, is equal to X subscript N. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. Is think about when you exchange what you're doing. If I sell you a good, right, what am I gaining in exchange? A piece of paper that says, so let's say you're an American, I sell you my coffee mug, right? So this is my coffee mug. I sell this to you, and you give me $1 American. Well, an American dollar is an asset. So by definition, I have $1 of goods going out and $1 of American assets coming in. Technically, what I've done is I've increased the net capital outflow by making net exports go up. I've acquired the foreign asset, which is the American dollar, in that purchase. So each time a foreigner buys a good from Canada, well, Canadian exports will go up. So X subscript N will increase, but the foreigner pays with his currency and assets. So what we're doing is purchasing his assets. We're exchanging the goods for assets. So in a case like this, when you have these two, you can see that by definition that they have to be equal. We can use NCO to complete something in our equation. So I said that it was related to I, right? Now, so now I've said that NX subscript N is equal to NCO by definition, right? So they're just two sides of an accounting ledger. Well, now that I've said that, we can introduce another model, and that will close the loop with our I term, right? So I said that it was related to investment. That was the first step. Seeing that NCO is equal to X subscript N was the first step to seeing why they're related. So let's start again with the model we had here, right? It's not a model again, it's an accounting identity. I should be more precise. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus XN. Let's move everything except I and XN to the left-hand side. So we'll rearrange the equation. So total income minus the total GDP minus total consumption minus all government spending is equal to investment plus XN. Now that we've rewritten it like that, let's keep this aside for just a second and concentrate on this. If we were in a closed economy, right, well, obviously XN wouldn't be an issue, but you remember that you saw that in a closed economy, savings were equal to I, investments, the capital goods, right? So whatever we saved in a closed economy was giving us whatever new investments we were doing to increase the capital stock. So S would be equal to I. But in an open economy, I is equal, so S is still equal to I, but you have to add this. And not only that, but think about how it actually works from the other side. Assuming that the government budget is, actually, I don't even need to assume that. My total income minus my consumption minus whatever the government has taken from whatever the government spends, well, what is left after that? Well, my income minus my consumption is what? My savings. Whatever I don't consume is saving. And whatever the government doesn't spend, we can assume here that the government has a balanced budget, but even if it doesn't, we don't really care because it will affect basically what's left for savings. Ta-da, savings is equal in an open economy to obviously all the investments we have. So some of our savings fund some of our investments, but it's also investments plus net exports. And we said that net exports was NCO, the net capital outflow. And so just because of that, you can see how we're working that to the idea that it's a fallacy and how mercantilism doesn't make you richer. Because by reworking the identity this way and getting this line here that I keep like circling, not circling, I'm more squaring it, we can see that actually imports do not make us poorer in any way. Because here we're going to see that it's possible that we may save more than we invest here because we're buying assets in foreign countries. We could be saving less here than we invest abroad because foreigners make up for the difference by wanting to invest here. So let's just go through that logic, that sentence that I just said. And some of you may want to pause after like that sentence I just said and just write it down. Like write exactly the sentence I just said before I switch slides so that you can like embed it into your brains better. So why would it be that this is actually showing that imports are not a bad thing? Well, think about it this way. If savings is greater than investments, it means that the NCO, the net capital outflow, has to be a positive number. And a net capital outflow, that's a positive number. It's like, it means that on net, we are, we have like, we're buying more of foreign assets than foreigners are buying our assets. Which means in a case like this that what we're doing is we're providing our savings to foreigners, because by buying their assets, we're giving them, we're going to be, because this is going to get to this, we are essentially buying their goods. Sorry, we want to buy their assets. So what we do is we export them our goods. So we sell them Canadian cars and Canadian financial services. And exchange, what we want is pieces of papers from their countries. So we give them goods for assets. We value the goods less than the assets they give us. So we're happy in a case like this. Our wealth grows and their capital stock grows. And I'm going to get to that in a second. If it's the reverse, where it's savings that is smaller than investment, then it means that the NCO is a negative number, which means it's an inflow, right? So if it's like remember what the word says, NCO is net capital outflow. If the net capital outflow is a negative number, then it's a net inflow. In a case like this, it means that we are buying fewer assets abroad than foreigners are buying from us. This is a net capital inflow. How does this speak to how wealthier it makes us? Well, remember that the wealth of anyone is the sum of assets that they own here and assets that they own abroad. If our savings are less than our investments, right, we are borrowing from foreigners. The foreigners would not, if our investments are greater than our savings, we're borrowing from foreigners. Foreigners would not be lending us because that's what they're doing, right? If we're making investments that our own savings can compensate, it's because they're actually making us loans for all intents and purposes. But they wouldn't make that loan if they didn't think that what they're giving us is what is making us more productive in the future, and that we would have the ability to repay them in the future. So what they're doing is essentially funding our capital investments. They're allowing us to build up a greater capital stock, which make our workers more productive. And by making our workers more productive, well, then we're happy campers. And the only way that they can do this is to buy our assets, to buy like shares in Canadian companies, to finance capital investments in Canada. Foreigners have to sell us their goods because then they're buying claims on Canadian securities. We like the goods, maybe they're capital goods, maybe they're like tractors or mechanical reapers for farms, maybe they're computers for us to use in businesses, whatever it is. They allow us to grow more productive. But if it's the reverse, right? Let's say we were buying assets from foreigners, we grow richer too because we're increasing our stock of wealth by acquiring and proceeds of future investment we're buying the returns on future investments at prices that are more competitive than if we had bought the returns from future investments in our country. So this idea is that regardless of which way you look at it, if savings is greater than investment, so that it means that in this case, NCO is greater than zero, or if investment is greater than savings, which means that NCO is a net inflow, so it's smaller than zero, in both cases, we grow richer. It doesn't matter at all. Whichever way it goes, nobody gives a hoot about it. And I think this citation from the Library of Economics and Liberty is pretty useful here. It's when a country runs a current account deficit, so that's basically a trade imbalance. In a case like this, it is either borrowing from or selling assets to the rest of the world to finance expenditures on imports in excess of export revenues. However, even when this results in an increase of net foreign indebtedness and associated with future debt servicing requirements, you can forget this, like that part of the sentence, like that even when, you can forget, like everything that goes up to between the two commas, you can forget it. It will promote economic wealth if the spending is for productive purposes that yield a greater return than is foregone, and the assets exchanged to finance the spending. Many developing countries with high rates of return on capital have run current account deficits for extremely long periods while enjoying rapid growth and solvency. The United States was one of these for a large part of the 19th century, borrowing from English investors to build railroads. So you can see what's happening here. The logic is that and I really like this quote, it's incredibly succinct and efficient. The idea is that we don't really care which way you grow rich. You just grow rich in both cases. And in fact, if you just stop to think about it for a second, right? Just let's go for the common intuition here. when you and I exchange, we go to the grocery store, wherever we go, and we make like a trade. That trade that happens between us, if you were to refuse it, you would refuse it on the premise that you are not gaining enough for what I'm offering, right? So if I said, here's my coffee cup, right? I want $25 from you. And you say, hell no, I don't want it for $25. What you're telling me is that your $25 is worth more than my coffee cup. And what I'm telling you is that my coffee cup is worth more to me, is worth less to me than $25. In for the exchange to happen, both parties must conceive that what is being exchanged, right, what I get from the exchange is worth more than what I give away. So by definition, if anybody trades in the world stage, there must be this idea that both parties are gaining. Otherwise, the exchange would not have happened. So here, what you're seeing is just that the accounting identity transfers, the y equals c plus I plus g plus xn, transfers into this when you do it properly, not the way that journalists do it sometimes. You get the entire story tied up to the assets that are being traded internationally. So clearly, if mercantilism's goal is to make xn go up, it's it's not going to make people richer. In fact, if it forces trades that are less productive than the set of alternatives, it could actually make a country poorer, if anything. So now we know theoretically that it's impossible for mercantilism to make a society richer. But if we make that claim that it can't, by restricting trade for the colonies, that it can't make countries richer. So it makes trades more expensive, it reduces foreign demand, it reduces the ability to acquire and make investments. All of these make like a colony poorer. But saying that it does doesn't mean that it does on a scale that's large enough to answer the question we have, right? So it's a good tool, but it could be that it's not like the most useful, like the most complete tool. And the reason why is that we want to answer the question, that is, why is Canada poorer than the United States, but pretty much rich in global term very early on? Well, if we wanted to lay the blame at the feet of mercantilism, we wouldn't get very far. So the claims that have been made by people who have tried to argue the opposite of what I just said, that mercantilism was the chief culprit of Canada and the United of Canada's economic retardation relative to the U.S. The reason why they make this claim is that there's two arguments that it breaks down into. The first one is that the by limiting the types of activities that the colonies could do, Canada became overly reliant on, for most of Canada, on the fur trade. So the harvesting of beaver pelts, moose skins, deer skins, mink skins, like any form of animal that has fur. These were essentially traded, and the argument that some scholars have made is that this this set of policies forced the colonies to be overly reliant on one particular export, and that in turn meant that it was not very diversified. And the second cousin explanation of this is that the demand for fur goods was relatively stable in Europe, but the supply in Canada was very volatile due to wars, to conflict with the natives, so that you would have a very volatile. Not only would you be overly reliant on furs, but it would be overly reliant on an industry that just jumps up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down until you just like can't see the end of like a crazy cycle of changes. And volatility is costly in that it makes it hard for people to develop steady plans and make long-term investments. That those two explanations are the ones that are advanced for why mercantilism made Canada poor. Is it meant that there was only one sector that could export, and there was only one mechanism, therefore, to acquire, to make investments into Canada. So you'd be selling the beaver skins and the beaver pelts, and the beaver pelts and skin would get you in that time coins and gold or assets. So you'd be like, the idea is you'd get those to finance some investment or to purchase foreign exports. But by limiting the volume of trade, it also meant that you were, because that's what it was, by putting those restrictions, you couldn't acquire as much from the exchange, so you couldn't offer as many things in return. So you couldn't offer, for example, shares or securities into, say, a Canadian business, because the only one that was available was the fur trade. This argument that advanced really doesn't amount to much. So just consider the aforementioned Navigation Act. So the Navigation Acts have been, where, like in the 1960s, were like a big topic of debates amongst economic historians, because they lend themselves very easily to economic analysis, and very few people would think that, yeah, these are smart policies. Like, no economist thought that, oh yeah, the Navigation Act, this idea of restricting the supply of services is like super good for development. No one actually believed that. But the debate was that, can it explain a lot? Can it explain the American Revolution? Because the Americans really didn't like the the Navigation Act, because it meant that they were paying higher prices for shipping goods to Britain, and it meant that they'd be worse off, and they paid also higher prices for British imports. And the argument that's advanced is that some people said, okay, let's just measure this. Let's try and find some data on trade, and let's try to get at a number of how costly the Navigation Act are. And the Navigation Act, I think it's important to point out, probably constitute the lion's share of the costs of mercantilism. So, like, think about this as like the best case scenario for saying that mercantilism is super, super duper mega costly. But when you calculate, and this depiction we have here on the screen, that's the high bound of costs. So, like, some people have like tried to get the net burden from these, and the number they find is like, that's the highest number of all the numbers, right? There are even smaller numbers out there. None of them say that it was a net positive. They all say it was a net burden. But like, this is like a top number. And what you get is that at best, the Navigation Acts, which are the lion's share of mercantilism's cost, maybe are equal to 1% of GDP for the United States. So that's like we're saying that the worst case policy doesn't explain that much. But notice also that this numbers here apply to the United States, to the American colonies. If it's roughly the same share for Canada, because as I said, there are no specific studies of the French equivalent of the Navigation Acts, but which in any case don't apply after 1760, because Canada becomes a British colony entirely, and the Navigation Acts start applying to Canada, which means we can assume that this this cost here would just extend to Canada as well. Maybe it'd be a bit bigger, maybe it'd be a bit smaller. We're not 100% sure. There's good reason, as we'll see in a few slides, to believe that it was probably a bit smaller, that the difference wouldn't be big enough. So you'd have that it's making everyone poor. It's making the American colonies poorer, and it's making the Canadian colonies poorer as well, but not by a big margin in total, but also in relative. Because say that it was like a cost of 1.3% of GDP for the American colonies, and say 1.5% for the Canadian colonies. Well, that 0.2 difference between the two costs isn't really big enough to explain like
the gap between both places. So here what we have is, yeah, no, this isn't working. This is too weak to explain like the big gap in living standard that we saw in lecture 5, which was that the Canadian colonies were massively poor. So clearly this doesn't explain enough. And not only that, but when you try to compare the the idea that mercantilism for Canada depressed trade heavily, right? And it made the region poor. Well, if we compare with the American colonies, so just want you to take attention at comparing, say, Quebec with New England, because these are the two closest comparables, you can see that they're pretty. By the way, there's a typo here. This should be 1.37. The person's article had a typo at the bottom, clearly, but you can see that heck, this isn't like a really big difference, right? So compare, say, for example, here, and the invisibles, by the way, is the value of shipping services. Notice that they're pretty much close to each other. There isn't that big of a difference between the two sets of colonies. And even when you compare with, say, the middle colonies, so this is like Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and these are the southern states, the gaps aren't gigantic, right? So, for example, these two and these two and these two, it's if mercantilism was that costly, it's not appearing in the raw numbers. There's still differences, right? Don't get me wrong. There's still like a small difference on some margin. Quebec does appear on some grounds to be poor. Well, of having a smaller international trade, but it doesn't seem that it's that big. It seems, in fact, relatively small. So, if ever mercantilism was to explain something, it's not explaining enough. It's not magnifying to big. It's probably making every one of them lower than they could otherwise have been, but it's not making one lower than everybody else. Another reason why we should be skeptical of this is that remember that one of the arguments for Canada is that it made Canada overly reliant on, say, stuff like furs. While it was true that the fur trade represented a large share of the economy, say, at the end of the 17th century, that share collapsed nearly like every given year. If you calculate GDP for the colony using some censuses and some other roundabout methods, you find that furs are actually start at like above 20% of all output, which means that a fifth of the economy was the fur trade. And in the span of roughly a century, it falls to 5%. And the gap between, say, Canada and the United States in both period is exactly the same. So clearly it's not enough. It's like far from enough to explain anything because here it actually runs counter to the argument. The fur trade is actually growing less and less relevant to the economy of the colonies over time. But the other part that really like for me kills the deals for saying that mercantilism mattered is the fact that when kings say stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter because if the king can't do stuff about it, he says there's a law. First of all, if I can't read, first of all, I don't know the law. But second, it could be that the king has no power to enforce his law. So if that's the case, then the law is just a piece of paper. So rather than having that quote that I like to say all the time, why do you quote laws to us who have swords? Is well, why would you impose laws on me when you don't have a sword? I'm not going to listen to it. You can't do anything about it. And so what you find is that most of the colonies, when the uh, the mercantilist policies are adopted, the colonists don't really care about them because they ignore them entirely. So, for example, there was a massive illegal trade in furs for Canada. There was, I think, like some numbers around, or like 15% of all furs that were traded were smuggled illegally, and that was for like Quebec. There was another region of Atlantic Canada that was known as Acadia, which we'll see more of next class when we talk about natives and settlers. Uh, Acadia was essentially stateless. There, the king was technically a part of that region, was under French rule for a long period of time, but the French colonists really didn't care. They the governors had no power. The colonists generally ignored what the governors said, and they traded pretty much freely with the natives, with New England, with Philadelphia. They traded like whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And if the king sent like a soldier or someone, first of all, he didn't have that much soldiers in that region. But if he tried to do something about it, the colonists would just, okay, we'll do it. We'll listen. And when the guys got it, just go back to doing exactly what they were doing before. So that lack of enforcement, for all intents and purposes, pretty much mean that mercantilism is not really like a big force. Not only that, but the authorities are aware of their lack of powers. Like, so much aware that they end up carving a lot of exceptions in the law to kind of make the de facto become de jure. So, for example, the Navigation Acts, which were never applied on the Great Lakes, there was never any reasonable enforcement because it said anything on water, but it also meant that, like, if you had, you could, the Navigation Act would also apply to the Great Lake. If you read the letter of the law, it should have limited the ability to trade between, like, Illinois, Indiana, and Ontario. But these laws were never applied on the Great Lakes, largely because the British Navy had, like, well, close to no power to do anything in that region. But then there was also exceptions that were carved into law to make this de facto. And in fact, the British actually, like, made it a policy, by the way, for the Great Lakes to not even try to make the enforcement. But there was also exceptions, as I said, that were carved into law. And one example of that was Quebec City. Quebec City, which was one of the largest port cities in North America, was made into a free port. And the free port was an exception to the Navigation Act. You could get a free port status. And the free port status meant that foreign ships could come into your port, even though without having being owned by a foreign power. And they could also transit by another point, if I remember properly. Maybe I'm mistaking something here, and I feel like I should check up and make sure I'm not making a mistake. But the idea here is that the free port was kind of an exception that loosened the law of the Navigation Acts. And so in 1765, I think, Quebec City is made into a free port, which means that they basically abandoned the idea of applying the largest share of mercantilists' policy to the biggest port in North America. Well, one of the biggest ports. And eventually they do the same thing with Halifax in Nova Scotia. They also decide, no, we're just gonna like say that the law has changed. We're gonna give them a special status. That's the free port status. And we're just gonna pretend that we do this because it's what we want. But in reality, it was a concession that they couldn't do anything about it. So the free ports, the idea that the authorities would themselves lessen the application of the Navigation Acts, which were again the lion's share of mercantilist policies cost, was it made it for a kind of, well, an admission that it didn't matter that much. And not only that, but I think the best case for saying that these laws were never very enforced, it's that this comes from an example from the British colonies, or the American colonies, sorry, that was on British rule. So we're talking New England, Pennsylvania, those states. In the American colonies, the governors and anyone who was appointed by the crown, they weren't paid by the government in London. They were paid by the colonial legislatures, which meant that the colonists could use the pay that they voted to governors and customs official to kind of leverage uh, the type of enforcement that they'd be made. So they had like a tool to control and restrict kind of the worst abuses of mercantilist policies. So think about, again, we start from like this set of numbers I gave you about the net burden of the Navigation Act, and then imagine that we add in details. Right. So one detail is that the enforcement wasn't really that strong. So the number would probably fall a bit. Then there's the fact that there are some tweaks that the colonists can twist people's arm to minimize the damages or to leverage in order to arrive, often, by the way, at governors making decisions that are against the directives that they get from London. Well, when you get that way of seeing it, you get, okay, that number that we saw on the table, the net burden, gets even a bit smaller now because of that. So it gets that, okay, we're getting further and further away for saying that this was like a big deal. We're like, no, it's probably like even the high bound is a low number, and there's no reason to believe that this high bound number is really actually valid, right? So this is like the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario isn't that bad. And even there, anything else actually makes it smaller. Uh, there are, however, and that is finally the only place where mercantilism can be assigned uh, some value as an explanation. In the Latin American colonies, so here we're talking about South America, there was much more serious enforcement of mercantilism, and the restrictions that the Spanish colonies had on their trade were much stricter. So you have that for Latin America, you get something that's like stricter laws that are better enforced, or there's more efforts at enforcement, I should say. In an instance like this, then maybe we can explain why North America as a whole is relatively rich early on, while Latin America is lagging behind. Now, the reason why I say this is that when you check the gap between Latin America and North America, it's roughly 2 to 1, 1.5 to 1. So there's like already a gap that's there early on of differences in living standards. And so you can arrive that, okay, maybe there is something to to be said of the cost of mercantilism if in Latin America it was much more strongly enforced. But beyond that, there isn't much that's actually can be said for mercantilism. It doesn't explain why Canada's poor. It may explain why Latin America is poor. We could jump into that if we were doing a class on Latin American economic history, but we aren't going to. So it's possible to concede that mercantilism made the Spanish colonies so much poorer that it explains some of the gap between them, but it doesn't explain why Canada is poorer than the United States. But not only that, but as I said, the argument that I've put to you is that the costs weren't that big. These were just like the gross costs. These weren't the net costs. See, one of the things that happens when you're a colony is that you get heavy military involvement by the mother country, and that means that most of your national defense is paid for by taxpayers in the mother country. And that basically means that you are getting more government expenditures than you are paying in taxes. So that actually means that the gross cost, the burden of the mercantilist policy, has to come with, well, kind of this other benefit, which is that you're a net recipient of imperial finances. And in a case like this, if you consider that the warfaring that comes with mercantilism is what gives you this extra net, like that you're a net benefactor of of imperial fine, so that you pay less in taxes than you get in spending from the central government. In a case like this, because it comes with mercantilism, it further minimizes the net cost to society. Right, the net cost to all societies is greater, because obviously the French people in France or the British people in Britain pay higher taxes than they otherwise would have. But the Canadians themselves are actually gaining, and the Americans also, by the way, are gaining in a case like this, because they're not paying taxes for goods that they receive that are produced by the British government, which namely is, in this case, national defense. So the more you pile on, the less mercantilism seems to be a potent explanation of what's happening, of at least explaining why a certain region is poor. So if we wanted to explain the colonial origins of the divergence of Canada, mercantilism isn't it. There is every reason to believe that this is a trivial explanation. It didn't help. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't helpful to have mercantilism, because without it, it's quite likely that we can draw a counterfactual, where we imagine a colony that actually Acadia does that, as we'll see next week. Acadia tells us that the place could have been richer by not necessarily a negligible margin, but not a big one either, but enough that you'd be happy to get the extra income. But not enough to explain why the region as a whole was poorer than the United States. So it's not a big player in the relative differences within the Americas, which leads us to like a parallel. Well, not a parallel here. It's a parenthesis that we want to cover. It's why would you adopt mercantilism in the first place? If it's not a net benefit or not a big net cost, why would kings like push for, or royal governments push for mercantilism? Well, the reason why this is a really neat little passage is that it's rent seeking. So in this passage here, I really like this one. So let me read it to you. Rent seeking interests in England and by colonial governments favored merchants explain this kind of mercantile regulation. One example makes the motive clear. The Act, here we go, I said it, passed Parliament in 1732 under pressures from London felt makers being essentially people who make hats. Already in fear of French competition, these London businesses were fearful of the establishment of a hat industry in the northern colonies. So this would be the American colonies. The act prohibited the exportation of hats from one colony to another. So that means that Boston couldn't trade hats with Philadelphia. It required colonists to have a 7-year apprenticeship before entering the trade, with apprentices limited to 2 per master. So part of the quote is missing. But here what you have is, you can see what's happening, right? The businesses that get a favored treatment under mercantilism are very happy. The London hat makers are very happy that the colonists can't compete with them. They're thrilled. They're excited. They're delighted. It's amazing. It's a party. But it means that for British consumers, in this case, that they're made poor because they have to pay higher prices. But the American colonists are also made poor because they don't get access to a foreign market. But in the process, by the way, these types of regulations were often bought for. So it wasn't corruption in the sense that we understand it today. But if, say, you received a charter that gave you a monopoly, you would actually have to buy that charter. You had to pay the king for the privilege of being the only person with a monopoly. So in the process, what does the king do? He gets a rent. He gets part of the benefits of protecting you from competition. So you get an exchange between the stationary bandit and some parties favored mercantile interest who exchange some of the rent. Okay, so I get this extra, I'm the merchant. I get this massive pile of extra profits, and I'm delighted about it. I'm going to offer you a cut of it, right? I'm actually going to promise beforehand. So let me rephrase the example. I'm going to offer to you a share of my extra profits so that you give that privilege to me, so that you pass a law that protects me from competition. So in the process, I gain, me the merchant, but the king gains as well because I pay him something, and that something serves for him to have an army, to have a navy, to have a big court with big parties and big palaces. There's an exchange of rent in this case here, and the king's happy and I'm happy, but society as a whole is made poorer. And that's essentially the explanation for why mercantilism existed. It's another form of rent seeking, and we still see it today without the same names. But today we still see, for example, as I mentioned earlier, it still exists in the airline industry in Canada, where uh, foreign firms are not allowed to provide services between Canadian cities. But that, who gains from that? Air Canada. Air Canada is very excited by the fact that they don't have competition for a large share of the Canadian market. Uh, and in a case, well, not a large share, all internal domestic flight, they don't get a lot of competition. They only get like a few firms and like a few regions that get to compete with them, like WestJet or something like that, and that's it. They don't get more competition. But but politicians also gain from this because they can get to say, see, we're protecting jobs in the airline industry in Canada. So that way, when they get votes in particularly important electoral constituencies, and they win votes, which is a form of rent extraction. So this is essentially the same thing as mercantilism back then. It's just a bit less obvious, but still the same thing. But that's it for today. That's it for our topic of mercantilism. So next week we talk about uh, First Nations, the fur trade, and Acadia, and then we'll jump afterwards to New Friends. Enjoy your week. Keep safe. Cheers.